Hey everybody, my name is Mark Davis. I'm with New England Debate, and this is a brief overview of how I judge a team policy round. I'm going to assume that you know the basic stuff about how debate works. There's two people on each side of the debate. There's an affirmative team and a negative team, etc. And I'm going to go into briefly how I make a decision when I'm judging a debate round. But before I get into that, I have six very basic principles uh, about judging that you should remember. The first one is that speaker points and who won the round are separate. It's perfectly fine and perfectly normal for the team to get whoever gets the fewest speaker points to end up winning the round. It is a separate evaluation, and just because a team speaks better doesn't necessarily mean that they made the best arguments or persuaded the best. The second principle is that flowing is incredibly important. You'll be given a flow sheet almost certainly when you go into judge, and that sheet has 8 columns in it for a policy round. Each of those columns is a speech, and the basic principle is that you keep track of the arguments such that the arguments and the responses to those arguments and those responses go across the page, across those columns as people keep reiterating or bringing up or responding to different arguments. So each speech is in a column, but the order in which you write that speech isn't necessarily in the same order as they give it. You want to make sure you're flowing arguments across the page so you can keep track of when arguments are responded to and when they're not, and what those responses are. The third principle is that pretty much everything is debatable. There are very, very few rules in debate, and don't let a team really don't really let a team argue that something is against the rules, like a type of argument is against the rules. That's not true at all. The only thing that's really in the rules is the speech lengths and some rules about behavior and such like and things like that. It's up to you to evaluate who gives the best arguments, up to the debaters to communicate their arguments well. So keep an open mind. If something seems odd, let them be open to letting them persuade you that it's actually a legitimate argument. The fourth principle along those lines is to best remove your personal bias and specialized knowledge from the round. Now, general knowledge is obviously okay, but if you have very specialized knowledge in the topic, or if you have strong personal bias about what kind of policies are best, you should remove those from the round. The reason being that if you let your bias influence who wins the round, why are the debaters even debating there? The point is to evaluate the debater's ability, and you'll oftentimes, if you judge enough, find yourself voting for policies that you would never support in real life, and that's perfectly okay. We're here to evaluate how well the debaters have done, not to just pass whatever policy you personally think is best. The fifth principle is that if an argument is not responded to, it is considered dropped and generally conceded. So debaters may mention dropped arguments. That's what that means. It means the argument was not responded to. And there are some gray areas that I don't think really absurd, plainly wrong statements that pretty much everyone in the world knows are wrong should be presented as truth if they are dropped. But do your best to not give credence to arguments that have been dropped once they've been responded to with a reasonable response. You should give the benefit to the team that responded and kept the round organized such that they were able to cover the argumentation. And if they say this argument is dropped and therefore we should win the argument, if that matches what your note taking, what your flow has indicated, then that's what you should do. The sixth and final thing is that there shouldn't be any new arguments in the rebuttals. There can be new responses, there certainly can be new evidence, new support, but brand new entire arguments should not be brought up in the rebuttal speech. Personally, if I see that, especially in one of the second rebuttals, the 2NR and the 2AR, I will simply stop writing down the argument. If it's obviously brand new, they're floundering, they're trying to just throw out everything they can, but they've never brought up this point before, I'm just going to put down my pen. I'm not going to write it down. I won't let that happen, and simply because we don't allow that as judges, because it's not fair if a team brings up some brand new devastating argument in the very last speech and no one has a chance to respond to it. All right, that's 6 basic principles. Here's the process I go through when I am making a decision. There are 5 different argument categories that you are going to hear most often. They are topicality, significance, inherency, solvency, and disadvantages. You're going to hear those words a lot, and that's because they're helpful for categorizing arguments and understanding them. They're not just fancy jargon for their own sake. How I evaluate it is kind of in that order that I just gave. So let's first start with topicality. This is the idea of whether or not the affirmative team's plan falls under the resolution that is given. This year, the resolution is regarding European immigration. So the fundamental question is this even relevant to the topic? In many rounds, topicality is not going to be an issue. If it is an issue, I look at it first because pretty much everyone agrees that if the negative team wins a topicality argument, they should win the round. Now, obviously, you should be open to debaters debating that statement, but I doubt you'll see that. So the first thing I look at is topicality because if the negative team wins, that's easy decision. I can vote for the negative team on topicality and then spend the rest of my ballot giving advice to the debaters. But most of the time, topicality isn't an issue. I'd say maybe 10-20% of the rounds it's brought up. So if I get past the topicality point, it either wasn't brought up or I think the affirmative team won the topicality argument, then I will move down to significance and inherency. Now, significance is an argument from the negative team that says the affirmative team's case, which is their reasons for change, the reasons why a policy should be passed, isn't as significant or as important as they claim. Um, you see these kinds of arguments all the time. Looking at the COVID situation right now, there's all kinds of argumentation you see on social media and such about how significant COVID is and how impactful it is as a virus, the death rates, et cetera, et cetera. These are all significance arguments, right? If someone was evaluating a policy of what we should do in response to COVID, how deadly it is or how rapidly it spreads is a valid debate to have. That's a significance argument. Most of the time, significance arguments by themselves are not going to win the negative team the round if they do well on them. Rather, significance arguments tend to support other arguments, so they bring down and mitigate the affirmative team's case. But at the end of the day, what I'm looking at when I'm evaluating the debate round is the fundamental question: is the affirmative team's plan a good idea? Is their policy a good idea? And if the problem that they present that is warranting that policy isn't a big deal, well, that's going to diminish the persuasiveness of their case and diminish how well I think it's a good idea. That's usually what happens with significance. Inherency is somewhat similar, and it is primarily dealing with whether or not the status quo, the word we call, the phrase that we use to say the way things are, is already dealing with the problem, the case that the affirmative team is presenting. So, in looking at the COVID example, uh, there was speculation, I know, back in the spring that warmer weather would wipe out the virus. It's turned out to be incorrect. Maybe it mitigates it a bit. I haven't read up on the science a lot, but that was an inherency argument, right? There were people arguing that the urgency to pass policies isn't as severe as people are making it out to be because as soon as we transition into summer and warmer weathers, the virus is going to be knocked out. That means that we just continue on the same path we are and the problem goes away. That's an inherency argument. And it's somewhat similar to significance. It tends to mitigate the affirmative team's case, their persuasiveness in terms of trying to enact a policy, that a policy is needed. And typically when I'm looking at significance and inherency, I'm saying, okay, how much of a case does the affirmative team have? How big do I think the problem is? And I move on. Again, significance and inherency typically aren't going to win the round by themselves. The third category of argument is solvency, and this is whether or not the affirmative team's plan will actually either solve the harms they've presented, the problems they've presented, or bring about the advantages that they say their policy, their plan will cause. So you can present all kinds of big problems in the status quo. Oh no, COVID is going to run rampant across the country. But if the policy that you're supporting doesn't actually help that in any way, there's no reason to pass it. And so, again, like significance and inherency, often solvency diminishes the persuasiveness of the case. So when I'm looking at that fundamental question, is the plan a good idea? These three types of arguments tend to mitigate how good of an idea the policy is. So after I look at inherency, solvency, and significance, I have an idea based on the arguments, based on the evidence back and forth of how good I think the affirmative team's plan is. And if I'm at this point and I am thoroughly convinced the plan does nothing, it doesn't solve the harm doesn't exist, then maybe I'll vote for the negative team right there. Typically in most rounds, maybe 95% of the time, after I evaluate these three categories of argument, I have an idea in my mind of how much good the plan is going to do. What harms will it solve, what benefits will it achieve, and that is typically less than what the affirmative team initially claimed it was, but it's typically not nothing. So at this point, I have kind of a snapshot of what I believe from the affirmative side about how good their plan is. Then we look at the final category of argument, and that is disadvantages. As the name implies, these are problems that the negative team identifies in the affirmative team's plan. So not only are the negative team is arguing, not only is the reason they're passing the plan not very important and it's not going to accomplish anything, but it's actually going to make things worse. And I look at disadvantages and see how much, based on the arguments and the evidence, et cetera, I think the plan will make the world worse. So then I have a snapshot of how much better I think the plan will make the world and how much worse it will make the world. I compare those two things, and if I think the plan is still a good idea, again, going back to that fundamental question, then I vote affirmative. If I think the plan is then a bad idea, I vote negative. That's a bit simplistic. There's another point here that is often an issue when I'm judging, and that is that I'm comparing apples and oranges. So if I think the plan will, again, going back to the COVID example, if I think the plan will reduce the number of COVID cases and reduce the risk of hospitals overflowing, but I think that it will increase suicide rates and that it will cause massive economic downturns. How do I compare those things? Those are just fundamentally different things. How do we value these different categories of policy impacts? The answer is that the debaters should be debating these questions as well. Oftentimes, I'm left with a situation where I have to make a decision. What do I think is more important when we're evaluating these different value categories? And the debaters haven't really done that work at all. And I tell them on the ballot, I tell them, you should have given me some reason to prefer your impacts to your opponent's impacts and have that kind of debate to make my decision more clear. Otherwise, you're throwing it out to me to insert some of my own opinion and some of my own bias into making the decision because I have to. And that, again, that's a fault of the debaters, but it is something very difficult. And that's kind of like the last thing that a good debater learns, typically because it's the most difficult thing to do. In that situation, you have to make a decision, affirmative or negative. Just explain it to the debaters. The worst thing that a debater gets when they open up their packet at the end of the tournament and look at the ballots is when there aren't any comments on the ballots. So as much as possible, debaters are dying to learn what you thought of the round, what you thought of each individual argument. Give a nice, good explanation of which arguments won, which arguments lost, which arguments won just a little bit, etc., and how you ultimately came to a decision. And that's going to be the most beneficial thing of all. So that's how I judge a policy round. And I think this is a very straightforward way of doing so. We look at some basic principles, and it all comes back to that fundamental question of, is the affirmative team's plan a good idea or not? Let the debaters debate and see what they persuade you of.